And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another installment of my DC Rebirth reading guide series. Today is video 3.3 in which we're going to be covering Justice League and Suicide Squad, but specifically the No Justice event, and then a trickle of Justice League stuff getting into Year of the Villain, and the next video in the series is going to be a massive deep dive into that Year of the Villain event. As a quick intro to where this fits in, as usual, just need to remember that I've read the entirety of DC Rebirth. The entire DC Rebirth is 3,370 single issues, give or take, and I've been releasing a guide for that. I've tackled all the smaller sections, out of continuity, black label, stuff like that, and now we're in the core, essential, mainstream continuity, which is 2,724 issues. As a quick reminder, on my YouTube channel, there are several playlists. They're the DC Rebirth All playlist, which covers every single DC Rebirth video I have ever and will ever do. But within that, I've split it out into 3 curated playlists, depending on your interests. One is for custom-bound comics, if that's what you're into. The other one is for this video and all the things related to this video, which is the core continuity. And then the final playlist is just all the non-core continuity stuff like Deceased and licensed comics and things like that. So hopefully, even though there's a lot of overlap between the playlists, you should be able to find the one you want and then dive into it fully. Finally, just going to remind you that before you watch this video, you should really go back and watch the introduction video for this series. That's video 0.0, because it sets the scene for this whole era of comics, as well as explaining how this reading guide follows directly on from my new 52 reading guide, as well as explaining which ones that I'm going to cover, which ones I'm excluding, what I define DC Rebirth as, and so on and so forth. I also cover ideas such as volumes with a big V and volumes with a small v, and what are type P and type J readers. And that last point I'm going to mention quite a lot in this video. So it's really important that you actually are familiar with what those concepts are, so you can understand what I talk about when I do my reading guides. Anyway, with no further ado, let's dive back into the map. And here we are, as expected, back at the map again. For those of you that have asked, yes, I have decided to merge the 2 maps rather than having them 2 separate links on my website. I now have them all on one link, so you can just scroll up and down between the high-level strategic overview and the low-level trade paperback overview, which actually, to be fair, was a really good suggestion. So thank you to the person that reached out and pointed that out. So let's have a look at where we are. What we've talked about over the last couple of videos is Justice League and Suicide Squad, carried on with Justice League, covered Justice League of America. Then in the last video, we then dived a lot into Dark Knight Metal and then continue this Justice League line here, which is this green bit here. So we're about to get into No Justice. When we get into No Justice, we're going to be covering what happens here in No Justice and then the start of a new Justice League series, which will be this one, and how this goes over, as you can see here, Unbroken Green Line, the intersection event called Drowned Earth, and then it goes into Year of the Villain. Now, what we're going to be covering, like I say, are those events, and it's really important to keep that in mind. We're going to look at No Justice, then the new Justice League series. We're going to touch and go at how it goes through Drowned Earth, and we are then going to move into Year of the Villain. We're going to stop before we get to Dark Knight's Death Metal. Okay, that's for today's video. So if we zoom out a little bit and we scroll down, what that means is essentially we are going to start here with No Justice, because the last video we ended here with Justice League Volume 7, Justice Lost. Then we're going to No Justice, and then as you'll see, there isn't a green line connected to them because this is the start of a brand new series. This is Justice League Volume with a small v and small volume with a big V as a new one. And this is written by Snyder. And then we're going to talk through that. We're going to talk through how this intersects with, as you can see here, the Drowned Earth event. Then we're going to talk through these trades until eventually we get to this massive trade here. And that's where we're going to draw a line before we dive into whatever is going on here, which I'll be explaining in a couple of videos' time. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay? As I say, I think it's really important that you have an overarching strategic idea of what these things are, of what we're covering in terms of these events here, compared to where they are just holistically. We've got No Justice, Justice League, Drowned Earth, and so on. I personally find it really helpful to keep that high-level view and then dive into the low-level view. So, keeping that in mind, here we are, No Justice, Let's get into it. So what is No Justice? Well, after the huge success, commercially and critically, of Dark Knight's Metal, the risky tactic of allowing Scott Snyder to come in and derail the Geoff Johns vision for DC Rebirth seemed to have paid off massively for DC. As a result, DC pivoted sharply to a Snyder-created vision for the DC universe, which included dropping the DC Rebirth branding and handing him the keys to the big car, to Justice League, in yet another series reset that takes the numbering back to 1. That's why this is volume with a small v1, the totality, but actually it includes in it Justice League issue 1, because we're going back to the ever so collectible rebooted #1 issue for this series. So in order to launch this, before he wanted to dive into his Justice League, Snyder decided to close out his previous Metal event whilst also setting up his next Metal event, and in doing that he authored a 4-issue miniseries called No Justice, which is this one here, and you can see the cover of the trade paperback there. So this series deals with the after effects of the ends of Dark Knight Metal, and specifically what happens with the Source Wall and the massive expansion of the DC universe. Now, I did mention in the last video that the last issue of Dark Knight's Metal, issue 6, says to be continued in No Justice, and it is. It's continued here. I discussed in the last video where these two volumes fit in. So yeah, No Justice continues straight on from Dark Knight's Metal. As such, No Justice is a 4-issue series. For some reason, it's only collected as a standard-sized trade paperback. Stay tuned for video 3.5 for me to explain where you can get an oversized hardcover version from. These issues are written by Snyder and James Tynion IV, who finds his star rising throughout the DC Rebirth era, but only really coming into his own right at the end of DC Rebirth and moving into Infinite Frontier. Speaking of which, James Tynion IV and Joshua Williamson, who has identical career arc. He's just a bit of a soldier, just writing his stories in DC Rebirth. By the time we get to Infinite Frontier, James Tynion and Joshua Williamson are kind of the future architects, but that's for a whole different reading guide. And the art's from Francis Manapul, who I'm a big fan of. So it's a 4-issue series. Note that issue 4 references the events of Green Arrow Annual 2, and on that note, I think I'm actually going to point out a couple of very specific things here about this. So when it comes to No Justice, there are 4 issues separate to the main mini-series of 4 issues that people often refer to as tie-in issues that are essential for reading No Justice. That's kind of true and kind of not. The 4 issues are as follows. The first one is DC Nation 0. Now, just to clarify, DC Nation 0 isn't a series, and it's not a comic series, and it's not even really a comic. It was a, series of 6 issues that were all promo things. It was all promotional interviews and adverts and things like that for DC Comics. That's why it was called DC Nation. And it was 7 issues, including issue 0. And issue 0 had a couple of cool comic vignettes in it to try to entice people to start picking it up and following it on. But issue 0 is the only one that really had any comic stories in it. And in that, as well as some advertising blurb, it also had 3 short vignettes. And we'll come across those later on as we talk about DC Rebirth. One of them, for example, is quite key for Batman. But in this case, one of those vignettes is a prelude to No Justice. So if you're reading this in singles, you do need to pick up DC Nation issue 0. If you're reading it in the trade, that vignette is collected in the trade paperback. And it is an important one to read to kind of set up No Justice. The second tie-in issue people talk about is Green Arrow Annual 2, which you can see here on the cover. And that is a useful tie-in to read, and issue 4 of No Justice refers to the event of Green Arrow Annual 2, so it is something you should check out if you get a chance. It's not essential, but I would recommend it. Then there are 2 pretty non-essential ones. There's the Titans special, which you can see here. It's branded from the events of No Justice, but it can be safely ignored. Just read it as part of his normal Titans read-through if you're reading Titans, which is what we're going to get to in section 4 of this reading guide. And then the other single issue that people talk about as a No Justice tie-in is Teen Titans Special 1, which again is branded from the events of No Justice on the top. And much like Titans, it can be safely ignored and you can just read it in its own series. It's absolutely non-essential whatsoever. So with those 4 little divergences out of the way, let's dive back to the main event. And here we are back at the strategic level map, and as you can see, we've got this granular level here, we've got the strategic level here, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed I've already tweaked it a little bit in the middle of this video to just highlight and underline the point I just made to you, which is about the two optional issues for Teen Titans and Titans. I just thought to myself it made sense to put those in red. So whilst Teen Titans is essential going into Dark Knight's Metal, it's non-essential going into No Justice, and then it becomes optional again going into the next event. So that's just to kind of clarify that. As I said, I can edit this on the fly, and I will be editing it on the fly, partly because what I want to be able to do is really keep this as accurate as possible. If I find the mistakes, if I find the errors, my goal is to keep this as up to date and as improved as possible at all times. Anyway, that's the No Justice event there, which you can see. So let's zoom on down. Let's have a look at it from a granular point of view. Back to the nice attractive pictures. So what does No Justice mean? What were the impacts of No Justice? Well, there's a few things to keep in mind. Firstly, a lot of online sources say very confidently that the Justice League story chronologically continues in the Milk Wars event. For those of you that have been watching my videos for the last few months, Milk Wars is a major event in the Young Animal imprint of DC Comics. I have that as a completely self-contained, completely standalone thing, nothing to do with the core continuity. So frankly, I would ignore it if I was you. The second big impact is that after the events of No Justice, we see two new Justice League series start, which are in turn Justice League Odyssey, as you can see here, and Justice League Dark, which you can see here. So those are two new things that launch there. If we zoom up a little bit and we go to the strategic map, you'll see we have No Justice here, and then we have Justice League Odyssey and Justice League Dark starting there. The overall storyline of No Justice, which is the one about the Omega Titans and the stuff about the Source Wall, eventually gets concluded in Justice League Annual 1 anyway, and that's as good a time as any to dive into Justice League from 2018. This is the Snyder Justice League. So let's zoom out. We're looking strategically. Let's dive down and let's look in detail. So we are now looking at these issues here. So this is the Justice League series which ran from 2018 to 2022. So it does actually go into the Infinite Frontier era, which I'm not going to be covering the last couple of issues or volumes of this as a result. I'm sticking with a great deal of focus straight on DC Rebirth. But following the events of No Justice, DC were now fully committed to Snyder's version of the DC universe and marked this by rebooting it. Like I say, it's a new volume with the big V, new volume with the small b. Not only does this completely ignore the Jeff Johns vision for DC Rebirth, but it even walks back several of his key ongoing plans, such as the redemption of Lex Luthor, which is something that started to happen halfway through the New 52. And like I say, note that whilst we're going to be following this all the way up, all the way through to the new, the Future State event you can see here, whilst we're following it all that way, we're not actually going to be covering it past that point, because it does, like I say, keep its numbering for at least a year into that Infinite Frontier era. But I don't want to get bogged down into that here, because as far as I'm concerned, that's a separate era. With that out of the way, let's dive into this volume with a small b by volume with a small v. Well, you've got to love how good the resolution on this, no matter how much I zoom in. So volume 1 here is the totality, written by Snyder and with art by Jorge Jimenez and Jim Cheung. I'm a massive fan of Jorge Jimenez, amazing artist. It collects issues 1 to 7 and it continues on directly from the epilogue of No Justice here. Interestingly, issue 5 is written by James Tynion IV with art from Doug Mankey, and it's part of something called the Legion of Doom, but we'll get to that in just a couple of minutes. So volume with a small v2 is called Graveyard of the Gods. It contains issues 8 to 10. Then it contains Justice League Aquaman The Drowned Earth special. Then it has issues 11 to 12. And then it contains the one-shot special Aquaman Justice League Drowned Earth special. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. Firstly, issue 8 is another Legion of Doom tie-in, so written by Tynion and so on and so forth. And issue 10 is a prelude to Drowned Earth. Now, just as we go into it, I just want to talk about what Drowned Earth is this event you can see here. So this is the event book for it. It's a crossover event between Justice League and Aquaman, and ironically is connected in its own standard size hardcover. So I want to talk about that now. What I'm showing you now is the list of issues in the Drowned Earth hardcover. So this is a standard size hardcover and it's an event book because it's specifically for the event. We've got Justice League 10, as I mentioned, this is the prelude. Then we have Aquaman 41, which is a tie-in issue, not essential, but definitely helps. We then have Titans issue 28. Again, it's a tie-in issue. One thing I will point out here is Titans issue 28. If you're reading it now, and this is like a case of you reading everything the way that I've been saying, so you read the Rebirth one shot, then you start reading Justice League and so on. If you get to this and you get to Titans 28, it is going to contain massive spoilers for the events Heroes in Crisis and for something major that happens during Tom King's Batman run. So I would completely understand if you avoided reading that issue and you decide not to read the event book for Drowned Earth. You can get away with just reading the Graveyard of the Gods, the trade paperback collection Justice League I just talked about. Anyway, then we get to the first one-shot, which is Justice League Aquaman Drowned Earth. We then get to Justice League 11, fine. We then get to Aquaman 42, which is just a tie-in, optional, but definitely useful context for this event. We then get to Justice League 12, and we then get to the final one-shot, Aquaman Justice League Drowned Earth. This is the full crossover event. Now, it's only available in a standard size hardcover, but one thing that I would say is that it is available in a full size hardcover and something that we're going to be talking about in video like 3.8 or 3.9 of this series. So if you're curious, just be patient and you'll hear more about it then. All right, we're back at the map. Let's zoom in again. We have Drowned Earth here. As you can see, this is the event book that we just talked about, but if you can't be bothered with the event book and the tie-ins, especially Titans 28, which as I said is riddled by spoilers, then you're fine just reading Graveyard of the Gods. It has the essential Justice League issues, and it has the two Drowned Earth one-shots that bookend it at the beginning and at the end. So you'll be okay just reading this if you want to avoid the event book. However, whether or not you're reading this or whether or not you're reading the event book, I am going to be honest, if you're a type J reader, you should just about be fine, but I wouldn't blame you if you decided to read this event as well. This is a kind of mini event book, which is the precursor to the Drowned Earth event. It's Sync Atlantis, and Sync Atlantis is a small crossover event between Suicide Squad and Aquaman. I'm just going to zoom out here, and you can see Sync Atlantis there. You don't have to read it before reading Drowned Earth, but if you are going to read it, then I recommend reading it after Justice League issue 9, which is the second issue of Graveyard of the Gods, or to read it just before reading Drowned Earth. Yeah, that's my recommendation. If we go up to the strategic map, as you see here, we can see Drowned Earth here, and here is Sync Atlantis. As I say, it's an Aquaman Suicide Squad crossover. It's not really essential in Suicide Squad, and when we get to that in video 3.7 or whatever it's going to be, something like that, then you will see that actually the Suicide Squad collections essentially ignore Sync Atlantis. It's very much more in the Aquaman Justice League space. But that said, here is where it is, and if you're reading Drowned Earth, I would not blame you at all for reading Graveyard of the Gods, reading the first two issues, 8 and 9, and then thinking, hey, screw it, I'm going to read Sync Atlantis and then read the event book. Or if you don't want to read the event book, you can just finish off Graveyard of the Gods. Hopefully, this approach is starting to explain to you why I've had to split this out in such an unusual way, focusing on macro events before diving into volumes, because the amount of event-led crossover in this era is stupid and annoying. Anyway, with no further ado, let's look at the third trade paperback for Justice League by Snyder, which is called Hawkworld. This contains issues 13 to 18, but it's 13, 14, 15, 16, then Justice League Annual 1, and then 17 and 18. People talk about Justice League Annual 1 a lot because it's got another kind of big DC universe-wide impact related to No Justice, so definitely worth reading. But that's the sequence. Annual 1 is set between issues 16 and 17, and also issues 13 and 18, so the first and last issues of this particular volume with a small v, are part of the Legion of Doom arc, which is written by James Tynion. We'll talk about that more in just a second. The fourth trade paperback you can see here is The Sixth Dimension, which is issues 19 to 28. I have to stress, this is issues 19 to 28. A lot of online guides that you will find, including listings on Amazon, say that it only goes to 25. That is not true, and I know this for a fact because I have this in my fucking library. So I'm looking at it and holding it in my hands. I've counted the issues 19 to 28. Of those issues, it's quite an interesting one. It leads very smoothly into the Year of the Villain event. So, the way it works is you've got issues 19 to 26, keeping in mind that issue 22 is actually another Legion of Doom issue, but again, more on that in just a second. Issue 25 is where they release or kind of showcase a new, slightly revamped Justice League logo. The logos for all of these series kind of shift and adjust very slightly throughout the entire series. Issue 26 refers to the event, the Year of the Villain special, which we'll talk about in the next video in this series, where we're talking about Year of the Villain. And then issues 26, 27, and 28 are all part of one arc called Apex Predator, which is the prelude to Year of the Villain. And in fact, issues 27 and 28 are branded as The Offer. If you don't know what The Offer is, the next video in this series talking about Year of the Villain explains about Offer branding. So that is what that trade paperback covers. It's issues 19 to 28, and those are all the details for all the individual issues within it. At this juncture, we're taking a quick aside to just talk about this Legion of Doom thing I've been mentioning repeatedly. So essentially, throughout the first 20 or so issues of Snyder's run, every 4 or 5 issues, James Tynion takes over and writes an issue called Legion of Doom Part whatever. And here they are. We have Justice League 5, 8, 13, 18, and 22, which are Legion of Doom's Part 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's various reasons that this happened, largely real-world publishing reasons, which is that Snyder had a lot to be getting on with, a lot to be writing, a lot to be planning, and so on. And so James Tynion was just stepping in as kind of a wingman, filling in the gaps in the publishing schedule where Snyder was having problems hitting those targets. Keeping in mind, Justice League was publishing twice a month at this stage. So that's what this Legion of Doom thing is. It's not necessarily its own arc per se, and within the trade paperbacks and the oversized hardcovers, which we'll talk about by the end of this video, they're just in numerical sequence, in chronological sequence. But it's worth keeping a note that's what these Legion of Doom issues are. All right, back to the map. So actually, let's go up to the strategic map. What we've gotten to now is we've just done Justice League, we've gone through where it goes into Drowned Earth, and we're now getting into the actual Year of the Villain event. Now, we're going to cover this in a huge amount of detail in the next video, which will be about an hour or so long, just talking about Year of the Villain. But in terms of what Justice League does, it's actually really interesting, and I just want to talk about it here briefly. So, Justice League, after the volume with a small v4, 6th dimension, then has volume with a small v5, which is called the Justice Doom War. And this, frankly, covers everything you need about Year of the Villain in and of itself. It's nice, tight, insular, kind of self-contained story there. So this contains issues 29 through to 39. And the majority of these are branded. So, issue 29 is branded Dark Gifts, as is issue 30. 31 and 32 are branded Evil Unleashed. 33 to 34 is branded Doom Rising, and so on. So I'm just going to go through it issue by issue and just kind of talk through what's in this particular volume with a small v. So issue 29 is the Doom War Prelude. It retells a lot of the main recent events. For example, it retells about the invasion of the Dark Multiverse from Dark Knight's Metal. It talks about the return of the Omega Titans in No Justice. That's kind of a spoiler, but kind of not, because if you haven't read No Justice, that means fucking nothing to you. It talks about the fall of the Totality and the rise of the Legion of Doom in the pre-existing issues. Long story short, bad things happen. And it talks about the triumvirate of Stegods returning during Drowned Earth, which we just talked about, the Drowned Earth event. Again, not really a spoiler, because if you haven't read it, you don't know what any of that means. And also it talks about the events about travelling into the 6th dimension, in literally the 6th dimension. So it is a recap of the last 20 or 30 odd issues. That's issue 29. Issue 30 all the way through to 39 then is Doom War. Doom War issue 1, issue 2, part 3, part 4, so on and so forth, all the way through. The only thing that I'd really point out there is that Issue 39, which is the Doom War finale, which is collected here, has an epilogue that leads directly into the events of Dark Knight's Metal. And in addition, it also says that what you then need to read next is this, Year of the Villain Hell Arisen, which is also a prologue to Dark Knight's Metal. Now, if we're looking at this, as you'll see, and as we'll talk about in 2 or 3 videos time, that then continues straight on with Dark Knight's Death Metal, I should have been saying. This is the epilogue that leads to Dark Knight Death Metal, and also it recommends you read this before you then go into Dark Knight's Death Metal, which, like I say, is what would then come next. You're probably wondering where these fit in. We'll talk about that in a couple of videos time. Not next video, but the video after it. But yeah, that's essentially what you then need to read next. And for my money, Justice Doom War is a really good, simple way to get a good overview of the whole Year of the Villain event. It makes sense by itself, and you've got to respect that. Okay. I'm just going to talk about the way these are collected in oversized hardcovers in just a second, because I think it actually is really important and, of course, really annoying. The DC in turn strikes again when it comes to mapping these things. But one thing I will just point out, and if you're a Type J reader, feel free just to tune out and skip the next 30 seconds. But for the Type Ps amongst you, at this point in the story, by the time you get to the Justice Doom War, at the same time, the original DC Rebirth timeline of Prime Earth has been rebooted a couple of times. One in Superman Reborn, and again at the end of Doomsday Clock 12 by Dr. Manhattan. So actually like another adjacent parallel timeline of the DC continuity. If you're a Type P reader, that's the sort of thing that's going to matter to you. Frankly, it doesn't matter to me at all, because at the end of the day, all this is going to get reset again in, surprise, surprise, another continuity resetting finale for Dark Knight's Death Metal. But if you're a Type P reader, that's the sort of thing you need to know. If you're a Type J reader, yeah, you can tune back in. I'm just going to talk about hardcover collections. So, as has become tradition, I am ending out this particular video by talking about the deluxe oversized hardcover editions as part of the Rebirth era. They're beautiful. They're released very consistently at the start of the Rebirth era. And they don't apply in this case. Because what happened in this case is by the time we get to No Justice, that branding ends. Now, they still release oversized hardcovers, and they do release them, but they're branded differently on the spine. And in this case, they look like this, which is the Snyder hardcovers. There are 3 Snyder Justice League hardcovers, which I own, and they're pretty good, but the way they're mapped is slightly annoying. So if we go to the map here, we're looking at the first couple of trade paperbacks. Oversized hardcover 1 contains issues Justice League 1 to 13 and the 2 Drowned Earth special one-shots. Now, it has them in sequence, so what that means is it's got issues 1 to 10, the Drowned Earth special Justice League Aquaman, issues 11 to 12, the Aquaman Justice League Drowned Earth special, and then issue 13. So essentially, what it covers as a whole is the entire Drowned Earth event without the tie-ins, which is absolutely fine. However, it's worth noting that that oversized hardcover 1 contains the first issue of the 3rd trade paperback. Issue 13 is over there in Hawkworld, but it's contained in this one hardcover that I've just shown you on the screen. Annoying and weird, just to say. The second hardcover looks like this, and nice deluxe hardcover, very consistent spine and mapping. Very different to the Rebirth spine design dust jacket, but the Snyder oversized hardcovers are very consistent in themselves and do look nice. So this one, the second oversized hardcover, contains issues 14, 15, 16, then Annual 1, exactly where it's supposed to be, and then issues 17 to 25. Lovely. Great, not a problem. That second hardcover is fine. The 3rd Snyder hardcover then picks up straight after that, and it picks up from issue 26. So it's issue 26 to 39, and contains everything in the Justice Doom War, as well as a few issues that are in the 6th dimension. This is where that bit of confusion comes in, where a lot of online guides, which are essentially lazy or ill-informed, they think the 6th dimension ends at issue 25. It doesn't. The trade paperback ends at issue 28, but the hardcover ends at issue 25. And then the 3rd hardcover picks up the last few issues from the 6th dimension and then contains the entirety of Justice Doom War. So again, these 3 volumes, lovely, tight. It's worth keeping in mind they don't collect the Drowned Earth tie-in issues, and they're not mapped in a really straightforward, direct, two trades, one hardcover kind of mapping, which you might be familiar with from other more conventional oversized hardcover collections. But there you are. They're recommended if you want to pick them up. That's what they look like. Cool. That's the end of this video. For the next video in this series, I'm going to be doing a massive in-depth overview of the Year of Villain event. It's going to take best part of about an hour. It builds on a previous video I did about a year ago talking about the Year of the Villain event, and hopefully you will find it useful and or interesting.
All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at I am Thomas Judge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.